Finn's bloody fingers slipped. The rough granite scraped mercilessly against his raw skin, stripping away another layer of frozen flesh as his boots kicked empty air. He hung precariously over a dizzying void, suspended entirely by a failing grip on the icy edge. Every frantic scrape of his footwear sent a shower of loose gravel cascading into the silent abyss below. His thick woolen gloves had worn through hours ago, leaving his bare knuckles exposed to the biting mountain wind. He squeezed his eyes shut behind fogged lenses, trying to find stable purchase where none existed. His heavy leather map case hung stubbornly from his shoulder strap, acting as a brutal anchor dragging his fragile frame downward. Inside that hardened leather tube rested 3 years of meticulous cartography, detailing trade routes and forgotten ruins. Right now, all that accumulated historical knowledge felt like nothing more than a lethal weight pulling him toward a rapid descent. A deep, aching cold systematically locked his frail right shoulder, cementing the thin joint into a useless, agonizing knot. He lacked the muscular mass to pull his own body weight over the icy rim. The cold logic of gravity was steadily winning the quiet war against his fading stamina. These treacherous drops held a grim reputation in the lowlands, famously lethal ravines that swallowed dozens of abandoned travelers every single winter. The Frost Peak Mountains did not negotiate with weakness, offering only sheer cliffs to those who faltered. Finn was an obsessive historian, a man accustomed to quiet libraries, not a seasoned mountaineer meant to survive this biting frost. He felt another fingernail tear against the unyielding stone, his desperate hold inching closer to the inevitable drop. The bitter wind howled through the narrow canyon below, eager to claim another discarded scholar. It is a terrifying realization when the mapmaker becomes just another lost coordinate. His hired mercenary escort had marched ahead at dawn, abandoning him to the harsh elements simply because his stride was too short. They took his meager rations, leaving him only his spilled ink, his rolled parchments, and the looming certainty of a quiet end. The betrayal stung less than the physical pain, a harsh testament to the brutal laws of the high passes. He tried to scream for help, but his frozen throat produced only a dry rasp that the gale instantly swallowed. He was entirely alone, a frail statistic waiting to be buried by the next snowfall. The mountain wind did not merely blow across the rock. It actively hunted, whistling sharply through the canyon walls. It sliced cleanly through his ruined coat, stealing the last meager pockets of body heat he had managed to harbor. His wire-rimmed spectacles, crooked on his freezing nose, blurred the gray sky above into a smeared canvas. The exhaustion settling into his bones felt almost warm, a dangerous temptation to simply let go. His left hand finally gave out entirely, sliding off the rock face with a sickening scrape of yielding skin. He dropped exactly 2 inches, his heart seizing in his chest. Suddenly, a massive grayish-green hand clamped firmly around the thick collar of his coat with the terrifying pressure of a steel vise. The violent force arrested his fall completely, jarring his teeth. The sheer size of the thick fingers wrapping around his neck made him feel like a fragile wooden doll caught in a giant's careless grip. He heard the heavy fabric of his coat groan loudly in protest under the unnatural strain. There was no gentle pull, only a raw exertion of overwhelming physical dominance. Before his panic mind could process the sudden intervention, his body was hauled violently upward over the jagged rim. The rough stone scraped fiercely against his ribs, but the colossal strength behind the grip pulled him straight through the blunt pain. Tharja did not struggle with his dead weight. She hoisted the frail human over the deadly drop in one fluid motion. The immense power behind her arm defied human mechanics. He was thrown forward, landing hard against the packed snow of the upper pass. Finn pressed his bruised cheek against the icy ground, his vision swimming as he tried to focus on his unexpected savior. Through his cracked lenses, he saw thick, muscular legs planted firmly in the snow, wrapped in scarred leather and heavy iron greaves. The towering orc woman stood silently over his trembling form, blocking out the harsh mountain wind with her sheer bulk. Faded white scars crisscrossed her grayish-green skin, silent testimonies of brutal tribal wars and deposed honor that his academic books could never truly capture. She exuded a dense heat and the sharp smell of cured hide, a stark contrast to his own shivering state. Sometimes, salvation arrives not in the shape of a gentle angel, but in the grim silhouette of an exiled outcast. Finn collapsed face first into the snow. The brutal impact forced the remaining oxygen from his lungs. Sharp, icy crystals bit instantly into his raw, scraped cheeks. He lay there, his thin chest heaving painfully against the frozen earth. Every desperate gasp pulled the freezing, thin mountain air deep into his chest, where it burned like swallowed embers. The abrupt change in pressure and the sheer shock of survival triggered a violent physical reaction. A loud, uncontrollable coughing fit racked his frail frame, shaking his shoulders violently. The massive hand holding his collar simply vanished. Tharja dropped him completely, letting gravity pull his fragile weight the remaining 2 feet to the packed frost. He hit the ground with a dull thud, his heavy leather map case bruising his ribs. There was no gentle lowering, no comforting hand to ease his shock. Survival in the frost peaks afforded no luxury of softness. He scrambled weakly onto his elbows, trying to push his crooked, fogged spectacles back up the bridge of his nose. He spat a mouthful of bloody snow onto the gray rock. Towering above him, the exiled orc did not offer a hand to help him rise. She stared down at his writhing, coughing form with dull, impassive eyes. Her massive, grayish-green hands rested loosely on the heavy iron pommel of her battle axe. The dense wolf fur of her cloak barely stirred in the harsh, biting wind. The cold here was not merely weather. It was a physical entity, an ancient, creeping death that sank directly into the marrow. He wheezed again, a pathetic, wet sound that echoed slightly against the sheer granite walls. "Stop crying, little man," Tharja grunted, her deep voice a rough rumble of displaced gravel. "The mountain hates noise." Finn froze, fighting the desperate urge to draw another ragged breath. He clamped a trembling, bloodied hand over his own mouth, suppressing the next cough into a muffled, painful wheeze. He stared up at her scarred face, terrified of the raw, brutal pragmatism radiating from her massive frame. Her worn leather armor bore deep gouges from old battles, the heavy iron greaves dented and scratched by years of unrelenting combat. She was a living weapon, forged in a harsh society that routinely discarded the weak. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Only the relentless howl of the wind dared to break the stillness. Finn forced himself to breathe through his nose, slow and shallow, letting the burning sensation in his lungs settle into a dull, manageable ache. He watched her thick, gray-green fingers tighten slightly on her axe handle. She was assessing him, weighing his usefulness against the calories required to keep him alive. He knew, with sudden clarity, that she would leave him here just as easily as his mercenaries had, if he proved to be a liability. He pushed himself up onto his knees, his limbs trembling uncontrollably from the adrenaline crash and the biting cold. He wiped his nose on his frozen sleeve, the stiff fabric scraping his skin. He had to prove his worth, and quickly. His leather boots, fine for cobblestone streets and library floors, were hopelessly inadequate against the packed, blue-tinged ice of the upper pass. His toes were entirely numb, reduced to useless, heavy lumps of cold flesh. He fumbled with his leather tube, his numb fingers slipping against the heavy brass buckles. He pulled out a small, corked vial of smelling salts, a standard academic precaution for long nights of study, now repurposed for desperate survival. He popped the cork with his teeth and inhaled sharply. The pungent, acidic sting of ammonia blasted through his sinuses, making his eyes water. But it cleared the agonizing fog from his brain. He needed his intellect sharp. It is a harsh truth that pity is a currency rarely accepted in the high passes. Finn scrambled upright, his knees knocked together with an uncontrollable, frantic rhythm. The biting wind immediately sought the tears in his woolen coat, eager to freeze the sweat cooling on his spine. He fumbled blindly at his heavy leather map case with clumsy, numb fingers, his raw knuckles screaming in protest against the stiff brass buckles. The cold had turned his skin into a patchwork of painful, bruised violet, making every micro-action feel like moving through thick mud. He finally yanked the leather cap free, desperate to secure a fragile anchor in this brutal exchange. He unrolled a stiff, frozen parchment map of the region. The thick vellum crackled loudly, resisting his weak grip as if it had turned to thin sheets of ice. The bitter mountain wind caught the heavy parchment instantly, whipping it violently toward his face and forcing him to press it close to his chest like a desperate, useless shield. The intricately drawn ink lines of ancient dwarven ruins blurred slightly under a fresh dusting of snow. He traced a trembling finger over the faded cartography, a map he had copied meticulously from the rotting archives of the lower city. His entire life's worth was suddenly reduced to these fragile, freezing lines. Tharja watched him with heavy, unblinking eyes. Her breath plumed in thick white clouds from her broad nostrils, betraying no exertion from hauling his dead weight over the cliff. She stood rooted like an ancient oak, her thick, scarred leather armor creaking softly as she shifted her massive weight. The iron rings woven into her heavy hide gauntlets clinked, a stark metallic reminder of her overwhelming martial power. She radiated a dangerous, latent energy, a warrior stripped of her clan, but not her lethal instincts. He was a mouse trying to negotiate with a starving mountain cat. "I know the path," Finn rasped, his voice cracking painfully in the freezing air. "I know the traps inside the ancestral forge." Tharja narrowed her eyes, her grayish-green brow furrowing in deep suspicion at the mention of the sacred ruins. The forge was a legend to her people, a place of ancient power lost to the encroaching ice centuries ago. "You are too fragile to survive the dark, human," she rumbled, her deep voice vibrating against his chest. "I can read the dead stone," he pushed back, his shivering forcing the map to rattle loudly against his ribs. "Dwarven iron does not yield to paper," Tharja countered, her thick fingers tracing a massive dent in her armor left by a usurper's mace. "Their machines crush bone into dust." Finn pressed the map closer, his knuckles stark white against the dark leather. "They crush what they can see," he wheezed, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "You protect my frail body from the shadows, and my knowledge will guide you safely through the lethally trapped dwarven halls." A long, agonizing silence settled over the icy ridge. Tharja glanced toward the looming, jagged silhouette of the mountain peak where the ancient ruins lay hidden. She had been exiled by a usurper, driven from her rightful place, and her immense brute strength alone had not been enough to reclaim her honor. She looked back down at the frail, shaking cartographer, weighing his bold claim against the sheer absurdity of his pathetic physical state. "If your paper lies," she growled, stepping so close he could smell the stale blood and cured leather on her armor, "I will use your bones to test the traps myself." She turned sharply, her massive wolf fur cloak sweeping a heavy cloud of snow over his freezing boots. Finn exhaled a ragged breath, quickly rolling the stiff parchment back into its leather housing before the wind could tear it completely. He stumbled forward, struggling instantly to match her long, relentless strides toward the looming darkness of the mountain's throat. The shadows of the ancient dwarven entrance seemed to actively swallow the meager daylight. Sometimes the most binding contracts are signed not with ink, but with the desperate mutual need to survive the coming night. They stepped into pitch blackness, The immediate absence of the howling wind felt physically heavy against Finn's freezing skin. The corridor smelled of trapped dust and undisturbed stone. He dragged his numb boots across the smooth granite floor, straining his eyes against the absolute dark. The temperature here was not a biting frost, but a stagnant cellar chill that settled directly into his aching joints. He wrapped his thin, shivering arms around his chest, acutely aware of how loudly his teeth chattered in the total silence. Beside him, Tharja moved with the heavy, confident steps of a predator accustomed to the lightless depths, her sheer mass displacing the stale air. A massive iron gate blocked their path forward. Finn raised a trembling hand, brushing his raw fingertips against the freezing metal surface. He could feel the intricate dwarven knotwork beneath layers of hardened, calcified dust. "It is sealed shut," he whispered, his voice sounding thin and pathetic in the vast cavern. Tharja did not answer with words, simply stepping past him and displacing him with a slight brush of her heavy leather greaves. She ran a thick, grayish-green thumb over the central seam of the immense double doors, feeling the age of the barrier. Her faded white scars, marks of a deposed chieftain who had survived a dozen usurpers' blades, starkly contrasted against the dark, oxidized metal. Dwarven iron of this era possessed a unique metallurgical stubbornness. It did not simply rust away under the assault of time. Instead, it bonded molecularly with the surrounding stone, fusing into a solid, impenetrable seal over the centuries. Finn knew from his rotting archival texts that unlocking these gates required complex counterweight mechanisms, massive water-driven gears long since dissolved into ruin. He started to unroll his stiff parchment map to search for a bypass tunnel, his frail shoulders slumping in bitter defeat. "We need a siege ram, or perhaps 3 days of alchemical dissolution," he muttered, nervously adjusting his crooked, wire-rimmed spectacles. Tharja planted her heavy boots firmly against the stone floor. She dropped her heavy iron battle-axe to the granite with a loud, ringing clatter that made the fragile scholar flinch instinctively. She leaned her colossal frame forward, pressing both massive, calloused hands flat against the stubborn iron. "Machines break, little man," she rumbled, the deep bass of her voice vibrating through the soles of Finn's ruined leather shoes. "Stone yields to muscle." She dug her heels in, the thick leather of her armor groaning loudly under the sudden, immense tension of her shifting muscles. The iron rings woven into her gauntlets bit deeply into the frozen metal of the gate. The sheer physical force she exerted defied his understanding of biological logic, requiring immense brute strength to break the seal. Finn watched in silent awe as the thick muscles of her back expanded, stretching the scarred hide of her tunic to its absolute tearing point. She was not just pushing. She was applying the brutal, desperate leverage of an exile who had lost everything but her raw strength. The ancient dwarven hinges began to emit a deep, agonizing screech. It was the horrific sound of metal tearing itself away from centuries of petrified sleep. A heavy shower of hardened rust and pulverized stone rained down from the massive archway, dusting Tharja's broad shoulders in a thick, gray shroud. The ancient hinges groaned with a deafening volume, echoing into the deep dark. The agonizing metallic scream reverberated endlessly into the tunnel ahead, a violent announcement of their arrival to whatever waited below. Tharja pushed through the immense resistance, her grayish-green skin flushing darker with the colossal effort. With a final, bone-shaking crack that rattled Finn's teeth, the bonded iron seal shattered completely. The massive left door gave way, scraping violently across the uneven floor with a heavy, reluctant thud that physically shook the frail historian off his feet. A wave of stale, dead air rushed out from the breached tomb, smelling faintly of dried sulfur and crushed bone. Finn pulled his torn collar up around his neck, coughing weakly into his sleeve against the thick cloud of ancient dust. He pushed himself up from the floor, picking up his dropped map case with trembling hands. He felt incredibly small standing next to the towering orc who had just overpowered centuries of dwarven engineering through sheer, bloody determination. Tharja retrieved her heavy axe, her breathing slow and measured, betraying no exhaustion from the impossible feat. The dense darkness ahead seemed to actively swallow the faint gray light leaking from the entrance. "Walk directly behind me," Tharja grunted, her yellow eyes scanning the pitch-black corridor with absolute predatory focus. "Do not step where my boots do not step." Finn nodded silently, his frail body completely dwarfed by her immense, protective shadow. He pulled his satchel tighter across his chest, mentally calculating the exact stride length required to follow her massive footprints in the dark. The true, crushing weight of the mountain pressed down on them now, a suffocating ceiling of stone and forgotten history. He clutched his vellum map like a fragile talisman, acutely aware that one wrong calculation would kill them both. Sometimes the heaviest doors are not meant to keep scavengers out, but to keep the ancient horrors safely locked inside. Finn dropped to his knees. The brutal impact sent a dull, throbbing ache straight through his frayed woolen trousers and deep into his freezing bones. He dragged his battered leather satchel around his hip, his numb, bruised fingers struggling against the stiff brass buckles. The subterranean air was stagnant and profoundly heavy, tasting faintly of oxidized metal and undisturbed centuries of dry rot. He pulled out a small, stiff-bristled brass brush with a polished oak handle, an expensive, delicate tool meant for gentle archival work in sunlit libraries, now repurposed for desperate survival. He leaned forward, his crooked, wire-rimmed spectacles sliding down the bridge of his nose as he squinted at a suspicious, unnatural geometric depression in the granite floor. His frail hands were shaking badly from the deep, agonizing cold of the mountain, but he violently forced his locked joints to be precise. He gripped the small wooden handle with white-knuckled desperation, ignoring the sharp cramps in his forearms. He began to meticulously sweep away a thick, heavy layer of petrified gray dust, the coarse bristles scratching rhythmically against the cold stone. It was a fragile, pathetic scratching sound in the immense, crushing silence of the ancient ruins. Slowly, the sharp-angled lines of an ancient dwarven pressure plate revealed themselves beneath the centuries of grime. The intricate, jagged script etched deeply into the stone was not mere decoration, but an older, brutal dialect of the mountain clans. It was a pragmatic language, forged in an era of constant subterranean warfare, designed to outlast the flesh of their enemies. To a mercenary or a layman, it was just a faded pattern on the dusty floor. To an obsessive cartographer who had spent 3 years translating restricted historical texts by candlelight, it was a highly specific mathematical equation of impending death. The runes detailed a precise weight threshold, a mechanical trigger designed specifically to ignore the scurrying of rats and activate only under a significant, armored load. Tharja loomed directly behind him, an immovable mountain of muscle and scarred leather. Her immense physical mass seemed to actively swallow the faint, ambient light leaking from the ruined entrance far behind them. The heavy iron rings woven into her thick gauntlets clinked with a slow, impatient rhythm as she shifted her colossal weight from one armored leg to the other. She exhaled a long, measured breath that ruffled the thin, dirty hair on the back of Finn's neck with a burst of dense, animal heat. She did not wait for his academic assessment, simply taking a heavy, decisive step forward into the dark. The thick, cured leather of her massive, iron-toed boot aimed squarely for the exact dead center of the cleared, runic flagstone. Finn threw his frail body backward with a sudden, frantic surge of adrenaline, his slick leather shoes scrambling desperately against the dusty granite. He shouted a sharp, panicked warning that tore violently at his raw, dry throat, just as Tharja's massive boot hovered over the stone. Tharja froze instantly, her heavy foot suspended barely a fraction of an inch above the etched trigger. The sheer, overwhelming muscular control required to completely arrest that much forward momentum mid-step was terrifying to witness.
"Do not touch that rune," Finn gasped, his thin chest heaving painfully as he pointed a trembling, dirt-stained finger at the floor. He swallowed hard, tasting dry copper and old dust. "It is a mechanical snare, perfectly preserved and designed for heavy armor." He pushed himself up onto one shaky elbow, frantically wiping the sweat and grime from his lenses with a dirty sleeve. "The pressure threshold is set specifically for stout dwarven infantry. My fragile weight would not depress it, but your massive bulk would engage the rusted gears instantly." He pointed a shaking hand toward the narrow, perfectly square architectural slits hidden deep within the shadows of the flanking stone walls. "Poisoned iron spikes," he wheezed, saving her from the lethal trap hidden in the walls. "Spring-loaded and angled to puncture downward at chest height, piercing the lung and pinning the intruder to the floor." Tharja slowly, deliberately pulled her foot back, moving with the cautious precision of a veteran who recognized the scent of a lethal ambush. She planted her heavy boot firmly on the solid, unmarked granite beside the trapped plate. She turned her heavy yellow gaze to the hidden wall slits, then slowly looked down at the shivering, pathetic scholar curled on the floor. Her scarred, grayish-green brow furrowed as she calculated the stark, uncomfortable reality of the exchange. Her immense brute strength, a force that had allowed her to survive decades of brutal tribal combat and usurpation, had just been rendered completely irrelevant by a simple, dusty stone. The fragile, coughing creature she had deemed a miserable burden had just casually bought her life with a frantic, desperate shout. "You see the hidden death," she stated flatly, a low rumble of genuine, grudging surprise vibrating deep in her broad chest. Finn nodded weakly, wrapping his thin woolen coat tighter against the encroaching, stagnant chill of the tomb. "I see the history," he corrected quietly, his teeth chattering with a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. "The ancient dwarves were fiercely paranoid engineers, not subtle tricksters. They always signed their mechanical traps with a warning, if you know how to read their dialect." Tharja grunted softly, slowly lowering the heavy iron head of her battle-axe to rest against the floor. "Then lead the way, little mapmaker," she said, her rough tone shedding a tiny fraction of its former, absolute contempt. "Read the dead stone for us, and I will keep the living shadows off your fragile back." It is a strange, quiet revelation when an apex predator realizes that the sharpest fang in the dark is sometimes a simple, scholarly mind. Finn slowly climbed to his feet, meticulously brushing the clinging, petrified dirt from his ruined trousers. The vast, pitch-black corridor stretched endlessly before them, a terrifying gauntlet of forgotten malice and engineered cruelty. He raised his small, flickering brass lantern, the meager yellow light barely pushing back the oppressive, heavy darkness of the mountain's throat. Every single step forward would now require a flawless, high-stakes translation of the ancient floor beneath them. Just as he carefully stepped over the disarmed pressure plate, a low, rhythmic mechanical grinding echoed from the deep blackness ahead. They retreated quickly into a circular stone antechamber as the mechanical grinding echoed ominously down the main corridor. The heavy dwarven masonry offered a temporary respite from the exposed, trapped hallway, wrapping them in a stagnant, oppressive silence. Finn slumped heavily against the curved granite wall, his slick leather shoes scraping uselessly against the petrified dust. The ambient temperature in this lightless tomb was far lower than the biting wind of the mountain pass. It was a still, suffocating cold that bypassed his torn woolen coat entirely and settled directly into his marrow. He dropped his small brass lantern to the floor, the meager yellow flame flickering weakly in the dead air. He pulled his knees tightly to his thin chest, wrapping his bruised arms around his shins in a desperate bid to conserve his failing body heat. A violent, uncontrollable shivering took hold of his frail frame, rattling his teeth together with a rapid, audible clatter. The chill of the ancient stone floor seeped through his thin trousers, numbing his legs from the thighs down. He pressed his crooked, wire-rimmed spectacles against his kneecaps, squeezing his eyes shut against the dizzying exhaustion threatening to pull him under. His frail human biology was simply not equipped to survive the prolonged, static freeze of the deep ruins. Hypothermia was no longer a distant threat. It was actively tracing the line of his spine. Tharja stood near the narrow archway, her heavy iron battle-axe resting easily against her scarred leather greaves. She watched the pathetic, trembling scholar with unblinking yellow eyes, her massive silhouette blocking out the dense shadows of the corridor. In her harsh, tribal upbringing, weakness of this magnitude was a fatal flaw, a burden the clan would abandon to the winter snows without a second thought. She had survived decades of brutal wars and a bloody usurpation by remaining harder than the frost that killed the weak. Yet this fragile creature had just preserved her life with nothing more than a panicked shout and a scholar's memory. The brutal laws of her past suddenly felt deeply misaligned with the quiet reality of this dark, ruined room. She reached up with her thick, grayish-green fingers to trace the heavy bone clasps resting on her broad collarbones. The massive wolf fur cloak draped over her shoulders was not merely a garment against the cold. It was a deeply sacred mantle, an ancient symbol of authority worn exclusively by the ruling chieftains of her bloodline. The thick, cured hide held the accumulated scent of sacred ceremonial fires and generations of fierce, unyielding pride. When the usurper had driven her from her ancestral tent, this heavy fur was the only piece of her deposed honor she had managed to carry into exile. To offer it to an outsider, especially a frail human, was an unthinkable breach of every martial tradition she knew. The sound of Finn's ragged, wet breathing broke the heavy silence of the antechamber. He was losing the battle against the cold, his shivering becoming weak and erratic, a dangerous physiological sign. Tharja closed her eyes for a brief moment, the faded white scars on her face pulling tight as she made a silent, irrevocable choice. Mercy and practical survival were beginning to outweigh the rigid, bloody traditions of her exiled clan. She hooked her thick thumbs under the polished bone toggles and pulled sharply, releasing the heavy leather straps. The massive garment slid from her broad shoulders with a soft, heavy rustle, exposing her scarred, dented iron armor to the stagnant chill. She crossed the small room in 2 long, silent strides, her heavy boots displacing the centuries of dust. Finn flinched instinctively as her colossal shadow fell over him, half expecting the lethal strike of a frustrated predator. Instead, Tharja dropped to one knee, the heavy iron plates of her armor clinking softly against the granite. She unfolded the massive wolf hide with rough, cautious precision, holding it out like a thick, heavy canopy. The sheer size of the skinned beast was staggering, easily wide enough to serve as a sturdy shelter tent for 2 grown men. She gently draped the sacred mantle over his trembling, curled form. The sheer, immense weight of the thick animal hide almost physically pinned Finn to the stone floor. It was like being crushed beneath a surprisingly soft, incredibly dense avalanche. The heavy fur instantly trapped his meager body heat, radiating an overwhelming, stored animal warmth that smelled of dry pine needles and old wood smoke. The sudden, intense shift in temperature drew a long, shuddering gasp from his burning lungs. He gripped the edges of the thick leather with numb, bleeding fingers, completely dwarfed beneath the sprawling gray fur. "Keep it tight around your neck, little mapmaker," Tharja rumbled softly, her deep voice lacking its usual abrasive edge. She settled onto the cold stone beside him, leaning her massive back against the curved wall and crossing her thick arms over her dented chest plate. "The deep stone steals the heat from your blood." Finn peered out from beneath the heavy collar, his crooked glasses slipping down his nose. The realization of what she had just sacrificed slowly pierced through the fog of his exhaustion. He saw the cold immediately biting into her exposed, scarred arms, yet she did not shiver. "This is a chieftain's hide," Finn whispered hoarsely, his throat dry and painful. Your people do not share their honor with outsiders. Tharja stared straight ahead into the dim yellow light of the lantern, her expression an unreadable mask of stoic endurance. My people followed a usurper who bought their loyalty with stolen iron, she replied flatly, her tone heavy with the melancholic weight of betrayal. Traditions did not save my throne, and they will not keep your fragile heart beating in this dark. She reached out, her thick, calloused fingers roughly adjusting a fold of the heavy fur over his exposed shoulder. He fell silent, the overwhelming heat of the thick pelt slowly unknotting the agonizing cramps in his frail limbs. The deep, traumatic ache of his abandonment on the upper pass began to dull beneath the sheer, heavy comfort of the sacred cloak. He was an unremarkable scholar, a discarded liability. Yet he was now wrapped in the royal mantle of an apex warrior. The colossal difference in their physical strength was absolute, but the quiet trust forming between them in the dark was entirely mutual. Sometimes, the heaviest armor a warrior can provide is simply the raw, unyielding warmth of their own survival. Tharja reached toward her heavy leather belt, her thick fingers unhooking a small, worn pouch tied tightly with a leather thong. The deep silence of the ancient antechamber settled around them, heavy and absolute, broken only by the faint, distant settling of the mountain's immense weight. Finn watched her from the safety of the heavy fur, the lingering chill in his bones finally surrendering to the quiet safety of the camp. The true measure of an alliance is rarely found in the heat of combat, but in the vulnerable, quiet moments when the weapons are lowered. The sharp flint sparked. A tiny, fragile ember caught the frayed edges of a dry moss wad. Finn watched from the heavy darkness, his chin buried deep in the sacred wolf fur. Tharja knelt beside his small brass lantern, carefully feeding the pathetic flame with splintered fragments of an ancient wooden crate. The ambient temperature of the circular antechamber stubbornly resisted the meager heat, clinging desperately to the frozen granite floor. She blew softly onto the kindling, her deep breath coaxing a steady yellow glow from the decaying wood. The sudden illumination cast long, dramatic shadows against the curved stone walls, revealing the sheer, overwhelming scale of the displaced chieftain. She reached into her worn leather pouch tied firmly to her heavy belt. Her thick fingers withdrew a dark, rigid strip of preserved rations. It smelled intensely of harsh brine and smoked pine, a stark contrast to the stagnant, dusty air of the dwarven ruins. Tharja grasped the ends of the tough provision, her massive forearms flexing visibly under her dented iron armor. She snapped the strip of dried, salted meat entirely in half with a sharp, resounding crack. The raw physical force required to break the cured muscle highlighted the vast, undeniable gap in their physical capabilities. She extended her scarred hand, offering the jagged portion to the shivering scholar. Finn carefully pulled one trembling hand free from the heavy fur cloak. He accepted the dark fragment, his pale, thin fingers brushing accidentally against her thick, calloused knuckles. The meat was completely unyielding. Feeling exactly as tough as cured boot leather, he brought it to his mouth, tearing a tiny fiber loose with his aching back teeth. The intense salt immediately flooded his dry tongue, forcing his sluggish salivary glands into painful action. He chewed the dense gristle slowly, letting the preserved fats provide a much-needed surge of raw calories. He felt a profound, exhausting gratitude for this quiet moment of shared survival. He noticed the highly methodical way she consumed her own half. Tharja did not rush the meal, grinding the tough fiber down with the steady, measured rhythm of a veteran campaigner. Her heavy jaw muscles worked relentlessly, accustomed to extracting maximum sustenance from the absolute bare minimum. In the harsh tribal camps of the northern steppes, food was never guaranteed, only earned through spilled blood or sheer endurance. He swallowed a dry lump, the heavy salt burning a rough path down his raw throat. He took a slow sip from his leather canteen to wash the dense meal down. The freezing water hit his empty stomach like a dropped stone, causing him to shiver slightly beneath the thick pelt.
The small fire popped loudly in the heavy silence. A lone orange spark spiraled upward toward the vaulted stone ceiling, dying instantly in the cold air. Tharja wiped her mouth with the back of her iron-ringed gauntlet, the metal scraping softly against her grayish-green skin. Her bright yellow eyes fixed firmly on his frail silhouette across the flickering flames. A quiet, tense exchange began to bridge the massive gap between their opposing worlds. "You bleed from a simple fall," she rumbled, her voice a deep, resonant bass in the quiet room. "Tell me how a frail human learned to read dead stone." Finn pushed his crooked spectacles up his bruised, freezing nose. He pulled the thick hide tighter around his narrow shoulders, anchoring himself deeply in the immense, stored warmth. "I spent 10 years locked in the lower city archives," he replied quietly, his voice raspy from the biting cold. "While your people fought the usurper for the high peaks, I fought starving rats for decaying parchment." He looked down at the half-eaten strip of salted meat resting in his palm. "My masters demanded highly accurate maps of the ancient iron veins hidden below the earth." He met her heavy gaze without flinching. "I learned the dwarven dialect because failing meant starvation on the freezing cobblestone streets." Tharja listened in heavy, unbroken silence. She processed the entirely alien concept of an academic war with visible difficulty. To her, combat was a visceral exchange of shattered shields and heavy iron axes, not a quiet struggle against rotting paper. Yet she clearly recognized the familiar, haunted look of a desperate survivor in his tired eyes. The brutal, unforgiving laws of the world applied everywhere, simply wearing vastly different masks in the city than they did on the mountain. She nodded slowly, silently acknowledging the unseen scars he carried beneath his fraying woolen coat. "You fought with your eyes," she grunted softly, her tone shifting toward a genuine, gruff respect. "My intellect is my only shield," Finn countered gently. He offered a weak, tired smile in return, the shared meal finally settling the frantic shaking of his frail limbs. The oppressive, crushing weight of the ancient tomb felt slightly less terrifying within the small circle of their firelight. They were two broken outcasts, discarded completely by their own kind, surviving purely by combining their drastically different strengths. A massive exiled warrior and an obsessive, shivering cartographer, deeply bound by necessity in the pitch black. True alliances are rarely forged in grand, brightly lit ceremonial halls. They are quietly hammered out over shared rations in the terrifying dark. The tunnel ended abruptly. A narrow, crumbling stone bridge spanned a seemingly bottomless chasm directly ahead. Finn stood frozen at the precipice, his breathing shallow and rapid in the stagnant air. The meager yellow light of his small brass lantern utterly failed to pierce the suffocating darkness below. The atmosphere here was entirely devoid of warmth, moving in a slow, unnatural updraft that smelled heavily of damp decay and pulverized rock. He clutched his battered leather satchel tightly against his thin chest, feeling the dizzying scale of the ancient ruin pressing directly against his frail senses. He knelt carefully on the cracked granite ledge. His ruined leather shoes scraped softly against the petrified dust. The cold stone bit instantly through his frayed woolen trousers, sending a dull ache into his kneecaps. Finn picked up a loose, jagged pebble from the ruined floor with his bare, bruised fingers. He held the small stone out over the terrifying void and dropped a pebble, counting the seconds in silence until it hit bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The faint, distant clatter finally echoed up from the lightless depths, a pathetic sound that only emphasized the colossal, lethal scale of the vertical drop. The masters of this mountain built for stability, not for the comfort of tall guests, Finn whispered. His voice trembled slightly in the vast cavern as he pushed his wire-rimmed spectacles up his freezing nose.
He knew from his rotting archival texts that these bridges were built for stout, low center of gravity dwarves. Their thick, dense bodies would cross without fear of shifting winds or crumbling edges. This specific mathematical geometry made them treacherous for a towering orc. Tharja stepped up beside him, her immense physical mass instantly making the narrow platform feel terrifyingly inadequate. She looked down at the fragile stone path. Her yellow eyes narrowed in harsh, predatory calculation. Her massive, grayish-green hands tightened slowly around the heavy iron handle of her battle axe. She did not express fear, only a grim, practical realization of the terrain's extreme disadvantage. "The rock is sick," she rumbled. Her deep voice vibrated ominously over the empty chasm. Finn nodded slowly, keeping his frail body pressed flat against the solid anchor of the entrance wall. He pointed a shaking finger at the center line of the bridge, indicating the only structurally sound path across the ruined span. Tharja took her first heavy step onto the bridge. The ancient stone groaned audibly beneath her colossal weight. She moved with deliberate, agonizing slowness, placing each massive, iron-toed boot with the extreme caution of a hunted beast. Her heavy leather armor, scarred by decades of tribal warfare, creaked loudly in the oppressive silence. Halfway across the terrifying void, disaster abruptly shattered the stillness. A piece of the stone edge crumbled under Tharja's massive tread. The sudden absence of solid ground caused her to sway dangerously over the void before regaining balance. Finn let out a raw, choked gasp. His weak hands flew up to cover his mouth. For one agonizing heartbeat, the heavy iron plates of her armor pulled her relentlessly toward the lightless abyss. The sheer, terrifying momentum of her top-heavy build threatened to drag her entirely over the jagged rim. With a sudden explosive exertion of raw core strength, Tharja violently threw her heavy upper body in the opposite direction. Her thick leather boots skidded harshly against the remaining granite, kicking a shower of loose pebbles into the dark before she stabilized. She dropped to one knee. Her chest heaved as she drove the steel head of her battle axe directly into the stone floor for a desperate anchor. Finn felt his own heart hammering frantically against his ribs. The colossal difference in their physical realities had almost killed her. The very brute strength that had saved him on the mountain cliff was now a fatal liability on this fragile, decaying architecture. "Walk only on the dark stone," Finn called out, his voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered panic. "The pale veins are structural rot." Tharja gave a slow, deep nod. Her knuckles were bone white around her weapon. She slowly rose to her feet, her breathing returning to a steady, measured rhythm. She navigated the rest of the lethal span with grueling precision. Finn followed closely behind, placing his small leather shoes exactly where her massive boots had tested the stone. They finally reached the solid, heavy granite of the far archway, but the mountain offered no respite. Just as Finn allowed a ragged sigh of relief to escape his lungs, a deep, earth-shaking rumble reverberated through the stone beneath their feet. A new, dense wave of petrified dust cascaded violently from the unseen ceiling above, thick and choking. The solid stone violently heaved. A deep, earth-shaking rumble reverberated violently through the ancient dwarven granite, rattling Finn's teeth inside his skull. The sound was not a natural earthquake, but the deliberate, terrifying grinding of massive gears waking from a centuries-long slumber. Dense waves of petrified dust cascaded violently from the unseen ceiling above, thick and choking in the stagnant air. The sudden seismic shift threw his frail equilibrium completely off-center, tearing his frantic grip from his leather satchel. The heavy vibrations of the incoming footsteps forced Finn to drop painfully to his knees just to keep his balance. He pressed his raw, bloody palms flat against the freezing floor, desperate for an anchor in the shifting dark. The vibrations traveled directly up his thin arms, a rhythmic, booming percussion that felt like a giant's heartbeat trapped inside the mountain rock. Two massive stone guardian golems stepped slowly out from their shadowed, concealed alcoves. Centuries of accumulated gray dust and thick, petrified cobwebs cascaded like ruined cloaks from their incredibly broad granite shoulders. They stood over 12 feet tall, their geometric limbs carved with brutal, pragmatic angles meant exclusively for slaughter, not art. The sheer displacement of dead air from their forward movement hit Finn's face like a physical blow. Finn recognized their imposing, boxy silhouette instantly from the restricted, rotting bestiaries of the lower city archives. These specific guardians were powered by volatile, glowing runic cores buried deep within their solid stone chests. The ancient dwarven artificers designed them specifically to crush heavily armored vanguard intruders into unrecognizable paste. He remembered reading the casualty reports from the Third Era. Entire mercenary companies had been reduced to red stains on these very floors. They possessed no flesh to tire, no blood to freeze, and absolutely no capacity for negotiation or mercy. The deep, violent, violet light from their internal cores began to bleed through the cracks in their granite armor. The eerie, pulsing illumination cast long, monstrous shadows across the ruined antechamber, revealing the sheer scale of the ambush. "Back away, human," Tharja barked, her deep voice cutting sharply through the deafening grind of stone. She stepped firmly in front of his kneeling, pathetic form, her heavy boots planting wide on the trembling, cracked floor tiles. She raised her thick iron battle-axe, the scarred metal catching the violent purple light of the approaching constructs. The iron rings woven into her heavy hide gauntlets clinked with a slow, deliberate rhythm as she adjusted her grip. She was a deposed chieftain, a survivor of brutal usurpation, but even she seemed small against the animated mountain. "They are entirely solid rock," Finn rasped desperately, his weak lungs burning as he inhaled the thick, ancient dust. "Your weapon will shatter completely against their thick plating before they even feel the kinetic strike." He watched her thick shoulder muscles tense under her cured leather armor, seemingly ignoring his academic, frantic warning. Tharja did not even turn her head to acknowledge his panicked advice. "My iron has broken tougher hides than this," she rumbled, the deep bass of her voice vibrating against the surrounding noise. "Stay down, mapmaker, or you will be crushed beneath their falling debris." The leftmost golem turned its featureless, heavily armored head toward the exiled orc. A terrifying, high-pitched whine began to build within its glowing chest cavity as arcane energy flooded its heavy, jointed limbs. It took a single, ponderous step forward, the sheer weight of its massive granite foot cracking the reinforced floor violently beneath it. Tharja did not retreat a single inch, her faded white scars illuminated harshly by the arcane glow. She let out a low, guttural growl, a primal sound forged in the brutal fighting pits of her youth, rising completely over the mechanical roar. Sometimes the oldest, most stubborn instinct of a warrior is to strike the mountain, even knowing the mountain will not bleed. The monster raised a colossal stone fist, the glowing dwarven runes along its forearm flaring with blinding, lethal heat. The stagnant, heavy air in the chamber suddenly smelled intensely of burning ozone and pulverized ancient flint. Finn scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his battered leather satchel dragging uselessly across the sharp debris. He felt the terrifying, helpless realization that all his vast historical knowledge could not stop the descending blow. The towering construct brought its massive arm down with the inescapable, crushing force of a falling meteor. Tharja swung her iron axe upward with a deafening, defiant roar, aiming directly for the descending granite block. The heavy iron struck stone. Tharja swung her battered battle-axe with brutal force, aiming straight for the nearest golem's broad chest. The impact sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a frozen anvil, a sharp, deafening crack that made Finn cover his ears. Instead of cutting deep, The thick blade simply bounced off the solid granite in a messy, blinding shower of orange sparks. The kinetic force of the blow had absolutely nowhere to go but backward into the striker. It traveled violently down the polished ashwood handle, straight into the orc's hands. It was a harsh, simple lesson in ancient dwarven building materials. The bone-jarring impact numbed Tharja's arms entirely, killing the feeling from her thick wrists all the way up to her scarred shoulders. The sudden, violent vibration felt exactly like plunging her bare hands into a bucket of freezing mountain water. She had carried that specific axe out of the salt mines 10 years ago, surviving endless, dirty pit fights where survival was the only rule. The heavy, nicked blade was forged to break whatever it couldn't cleanly cut, usually cheap bronze shields and rusted mercenary chainmail. Now it just left a shallow, powdery white scratch on the smooth, gray chest of the walking rock. Her thick, calloused fingers involuntarily loosened their grip as the shockwave temporarily paralyzed her dense muscles. It is a terrifying thing when a veteran warrior realizes her absolute best swing is completely useless. The stone guardian didn't even pause its slow, deliberate march. It just kept walking forward, incredibly heavy and slow, its glowing violet runic core pulsing steadily through the thick dust. The harsh purple light threw long, ugly shadows against the ruined, vaulted ceiling. It raised a massive, blocky fist, the heavy stone pushing the stale cellar air aside with a low, menacing hum. "Move your feet, human!" Tharja barked, her voice tight with strain. She threw her massive weight backward, trusting deeply ingrained survival instincts to pull her out of the immediate crush zone. The golem's fist hit the stone floor, exactly where she had just been standing a second before. The impact shattered the ancient granite tiles like brittle glass, kicking up a thick, choking cloud of pulverized gray debris. Finn watched the whole ugly exchange from his spot on the cold floor, shivering violently beneath the heavy, sacred wolf fur cloak. The sheer, undeniable difference in their physical realities was painfully obvious in the narrow confines of the tomb. Tharja, a towering outcast who had effortlessly hauled his dead weight over a cliff, was being casually pushed around by a mindless piece of architecture. Jagged, sharp pieces of the shattered floor rained down on him, pinging sharply off the scattered dwarven debris around his boots. He pulled the heavy animal hide completely over his head, coughing quietly as the dry dust filled his lungs. He clutched his battered leather map case tightly to his chest, desperately trying to force his panicked, racing mind to work. "I told you it was solid rock!" Finn yelled over the grinding noise, his voice cracking with fear. If her immense muscle couldn't stop the advancing thing, they were going to be flattened into the floor very soon. The ancient dwarven engineers didn't build these guardians to fight. They built them to systematically eradicate intruders through sheer, unstoppable attrition. He wiped his dirty, fogged lenses with a trembling sleeve, his eyes darting across the golem's moving joints. Tharja stumbled back awkwardly, her heavy, iron-toed boots slipping badly on the fresh layer of pulverized rock. Her broad chest heaved as she desperately tried to shake the painful numbness out of her heavy arms. Her scarred leather armor, worn thin by years of sleeping rough on the steps, creaked loudly as she fought to keep her balance. She stared blankly at her dull, vibrating axe blade, her yellow eyes wide with a very rare, very uncomfortable vulnerability. The old bloody traditions of her exiled clan told her to stand her ground and keep swinging until her heart stopped. But the cold, practical reality of this dark, ruined hole simply didn't care about tribal honor or stubborn pride. She took another heavy, reluctant step back, putting a few precious feet between herself and the advancing stone giant. Her thick, grayish-green hands gripped the wooden axe handle tightly, her muscles stubbornly refusing to work right. The immovable, dense mass of the old dwarven machine had completely broken her lifelong reliance on sheer, overwhelming strength. She grunted, a rough, exhausted sound of pure frustration, and backed up toward the shivering scholar still huddled on the floor.
"My iron cannot bite this stone!" she yelled over her shoulder, her voice thick with a bitter, desperate realization. Sometimes the absolute hardest part of a fight is openly admitting that hitting the wall harder isn't going to break it. Finn scrambled across the floor. A violent tremor from the advancing construct threw him completely off his knees. He slid painfully across the shattered granite, his frayed trousers tearing against sharp fragments of pulverized tile. His frantic retreat pushed him directly against the curved perimeter of the ancient antechamber. He pressed his thin spine hard against the damp rock, his breathing coming in ragged gasps that tasted heavily of dry sulfur. The deafening booming of the stone guardians consumed all other sound in the ruined hall. He frantically pushed his crooked spectacles up the bridge of his bruised nose, desperate to see. The choking dust kicked up by the stone fists coated his fragile lenses in a thick paste. The sudden blindness spiked his physical terror, rendering the violent geometry of the golems into blurry silhouettes. He instinctively raised his arm, wiping the obscured glass violently with a trembling sleeve. The coarse fabric scratched the delicate lens, but it cleared enough grime to reveal the faded mural carved directly into the wall beside his head. He leaned closer, feeling the chilling draft emitting from the porous stone against his damp cheek. The intricate carvings stretched across the dark expanse like a sprawling schematic. To a terrified mercenary, it was just a jumble of jagged lines. To an obsessive cartographer, who had survived 10 years decoding architectural drafts in the lower city, it was a preserved blueprint. He squinted through his smeared lenses, his eyes rapidly tracing the rigid flow of the old mountain dialect. The agonizing cold of the tomb momentarily vanished, entirely replaced by the singular focus of his scholarly training. His mind shifted gears, trading the immediate panic for analytical translation. He remembered the grueling nights spent translating similar restricted texts by candlelight, a desperate survival tactic to avoid starvation on the winter streets. Now, that same obscure knowledge was the only barrier between him and a violent flattening. Tharja let out another guttural roar, dodging a swinging strike that shattered a pillar into sharp shrapnel. She possessed the raw stamina of a hardened gladiator, but her iron battle-axe was simply the wrong tool for this specific execution. She was fighting a mountain with a metal wedge. The kinetic shock of her blocked strikes was visibly exhausting her dense muscles, her scarred armor heaving with every desperate breath. Finn watched her heavy boots slide on the ruined floor, realizing with absolute certainty that her brute strength was failing. If he could not decode the dead wall, she would be ground into the floorboards within 3 minutes. She swung again, the resulting metallic clang echoing uselessly through the cavern. He pressed his dirty face closer to the runic script, his raw fingertips tracing the grooved stone. The mural depicted the very construction of the Guardians towering behind him. The dwarven engineers were deeply paranoid, meticulously documenting the maintenance and dismantling of their own creations. He read the jagged script, translating the archaic technical terms with desperate speed. The constructs were powered by volatile cores, but their granite limbs required magical articulation to actually bend. The rock did not stretch, it pivoted on concentrated points of pure energy. The text warned engineers of the massive kinetic transfer occurring within the lower mechanical joints during standard locomotion. His dirt-stained fingers stopped abruptly on an etched diagram near the base of the carved mural. The diagram highlighted the overlapping plates designed to protect the massive joints from frontal assault. He traced the schematic down to the construct's thick legs, uncovering the fatal compromise in the ancient design. To maintain forward momentum, the stone knee plating had to remain open at the back. He realized the golems possessed magical weak points hidden from plain sight. Tucked directly behind those heavy joints were small, glowing runic hinges that connected the moving blocks. It was a brilliant, highly specific mechanical vulnerability.
The glowing hinges were the only parts of the towering monsters not protected by impenetrable rock. If those arcane joints were shattered, the kinetic weight of the upper body would instantly collapse the remaining structure. Finn turned his head, watching the violet light bleeding from the joints of the advancing golem. He saw the exposed gaps flaring brightly behind their thick knees every time they took an earth-shaking step. He swallowed hard, his dry throat clicking loudly in his own ears. The solution was written plainly in stone, but communicating it over the roar of combat would require him to leave his fragile sanctuary. A profound clarity settled over the shivering scholar amidst the deafening chaos. The brutal laws of the high passes dictated that the strongest always survived. But this specific tomb operated on a different logic. The exiled orc possessed enough physical power to shatter timber and bone, yet she was currently losing to a mere puzzle. He possessed the frail body of a discarded academic, yet he held the mathematical key to dismantling the impossible threat. True survival in the deep dark does not rely on who strikes the hardest, but on who knows exactly where to place the blade. The nearest construct raised both massive fists, preparing to bring a catastrophic strike down on Tharja's exposed position. The arcane light swelled dangerously within its broad chest. Finn forced himself upright. His torn knees protested the sudden movement with a sharp, stabbing pain. He ignored the burning ache, standing up and pointing directly at the glowing gaps behind the monster's knees. The violet light flared intensely with every heavy step the ancient constructs took. It was a terrifying, beautiful mechanical flaw hidden entirely by their massive granite thighs. He opened his dry mouth to shout the critical discovery to the desperate warrior. The ruins swallowed his voice. The deafening sound of grinding stone drowned out his voice almost instantly. The towering golems displaced the stagnant air with an oppressive, physical roar. Tharja kept swinging her heavy axe, her thick muscles bunching under her scarred leather armor. She could not hear his academic revelation over the catastrophic booming of the blocked strikes. A harsh truth of the deep dark is that an unheard warning is exactly as useless as a silent lie. He abandoned his safe corner. The terrifying cacophony forced the frail human to run dangerously close to the swinging stone fists to be heard. He darted past a shattered pillar, throwing his small body into the violent, kinetic wake of the nearest golem. The displaced air whipped his frayed coat, carrying the bitter scent of scorched flint and ancient rot. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat to the shadows. He pushed through the overwhelming terror, driven entirely by the quiet loyalty forged under a shared fur cloak. He stopped directly behind Tharja. The massive orc heaved a ragged breath, preparing to block another impossible downward blow. Finn cupped his bleeding hands around his mouth, filling his burning lungs with the dusty cellar air. He screams the exact runic flaws to Tharja, his raspy voice tearing painfully in his raw throat. He yelled about the magical hinges, detailing the precise upward angle needed to bypass the thick plating. Sometimes a scholar must temporarily trade the quiet whisper of the library for the desperate scream of the battlefield. Finn hurled a jagged stone. His bleeding, raw fingers scraped painfully against the coarse texture of a ruined granite as he let it fly. The heavy, desperate projectile was an act of pure, academic defiance in the face of overwhelming physical doom. Finn throws loose rocks at the golem's face to distract its glowing stone eyes. The stone struck the ancient, featureless mask with a sharp, pathetic crack that echoed loudly in the stagnant air. It did absolutely zero structural damage to the thick plating, but it successfully hijacked the construct's mechanical targeting logic. The violent violet light bleeding from the monster's ocular slits instantly flickered, tracking the sudden, annoying movement of the frail human. Sometimes, surviving a predator does not require breaking its teeth, but merely forcing it to look the wrong way. The towering mountain of animated rock pivoted heavily on its thick, grinding axis. It shifted its terrible, crushing focus away from the exhausted warrior, and locked onto the shivering scholar huddled in the dust. Tharja did not hesitate or waste the precious split-second window his fragile distraction had bought her. Tharja ducks under a massive, crushing blow. The sheer kinetic displacement of the golem's sweeping stone fist tore through the stale air, ripping a violent, localized gale through the dark tomb. Her scarred leather armor, hardened by decades of brutal survival in the northern steppes, groaned loudly as she dropped her center of gravity entirely. She moved beneath the lethal horizontal strike with the terrifying, practiced precision of a gladiator who had survived the salt mines. She anchored her heavy, iron-toed boots deeply into the shattered, uneven floor tiles. Her thick, grayish-green hands gripped the ashwood handle of her battered battle-axe, her dense muscles bunching under the immense, calculated strain. Following Finn's exact instructions, she angles her axe perfectly upward, driving the steel blade deep into the shattered runic hinge. The heavy, nicked iron edge did not bounce uselessly off the impenetrable granite thigh this time. It bit viciously and deeply into the exposed, glowing violet gap hidden directly behind the monster's thick knee. The brutal mechanical impact triggered a blinding, catastrophic release of pressurized, arcane energy that instantly smelled of lightning and burning ozone. A deafening, high-pitched shriek of dying dwarven magic violently shook the curved stone walls of the antechamber. The heavy steel blade successfully severed the ethereal, glowing joint connecting the massive, lower granite blocks. Without the binding ancient rune, the golem's thick leg instantly ceased to function as a supportive pillar. The immense crushing weight of its own heavily armored upper torso immediately became its executioner. The golem falls forward. Thousands of pounds of dead, unguided rock plummeted downward, aiming directly for the spot where Finn knelt helplessly in the debris. The frail cartographer froze completely, his lungs seizing in raw terror as the colossal shadow rapidly eclipsed his vision. His exhausted, freezing limbs simply refused the frantic mental command to scramble out of the lethal crush zone. Suddenly, a massive, calloused hand shot into his peripheral vision, entirely blocking the falling rock. Tharja physically grabs the falling stone shoulder, throwing the monster aside to protect Finn. She intercepted the plummeting, jagged boulder with her bare, thick hands, her heavy back muscles swelling to the absolute breaking point. The sheer, overwhelming exertion of her raw, brute force defied all biological logic, physically halting the crushing momentum for one agonizing heartbeat. She let out a raw, guttural roar of pure, tribal defiance, violently redirecting the falling torso away from the fragile human's position. The shattered, heavy ruin of the Guardian crashed into the stone floor a mere yard away, violently shaking the entire room. A thick, choking cloud of pulverized gray debris washed over them both, tasting heavily of dry rot and victory. The violent synergy of their drastically different strengths had systematically dismantled an impossible, ancient threat. The absolute heaviest blows are worthless if they strike impenetrable armor, but the sharpest mind is dead without the raw strength to wield the blade. The echo of the collapsing stone guardian faded into a heavy, ringing silence. A thick blanket of pulverized granite hung in the stagnant air, slowly settling over the ruined antechamber. Finn remained frozen on the cracked floorboards. His lungs burned with every shallow breath. He stared at the shattered boulder resting mere inches from his ruined shoes. On the unforgiving streets of the lower city, a misstep meant a beating. In this dark tomb, a miscalculation meant instant burial. He slowly wiped the thick grit from his wire-rimmed spectacles using the relatively clean inside of his torn coat. Tharja stood a few paces away. She leaned her weight against the ashwood handle of her battle-axe. The steel blade was visibly chipped from the desperate strike against the runic hinge. A thin trail of dark blood mapped a path down her scarred cheek, courtesy of a flying stone fragment. She ignored the sting, her chest rising and falling in a steady, controlled rhythm.
The brutal fighting pits of her youth demanded immediate readiness for the next opponent, but the surrounding dark offered only stillness. She turned her yellow gaze toward the human. Finn pushed himself onto his knees. His joints ached with a dull, persistent throb. He gathered his scattered map case and the small brass lantern. The fragile glass globe had miraculously survived the chaos. "Are you injured?" he asked. His voice sounded painfully thin. "Stone scrapes," she replied. She rubbed a thumb over the cut on her cheek, smearing the blood across her grayish-green skin. She stepped over the rubble of the fallen construct. "Your strange sight saved us." "The mountain broke itself." He managed a tired, strained smile. "The mountain engineers left their blueprints. I just read the manual." Tharja grunted. It was a sound of quiet approval. She picked up the heavy wolf fur cloak that had fallen during the scramble. She shook the dust from the sacred hide with a sharp snap of her wrists. Instead of draping it over her own shoulders, she handed the thick pelt back to the shivering cartographer. The deep chill of the ruins was already seeping back into the room, creeping through the soles of their boots. Finn accepted the hide, pulling the dense warmth tightly around his narrow shoulders. Giving away the only heat source in a freezing tomb is a heavier vow than any blood oath. They retreated from the shattered hall. Finn led the way this time, holding the flickering lantern high. He navigated by the faded murals, searching for a maintenance alcove indicated on the ancient walls. They found a small, rectangular chamber with a low ceiling and a single, narrow entrance. It offered a defensible bottleneck and a reprieve from the cavernous drafts. Tharja sat heavily against the far wall. She unbuckled her dented iron chestplate. The leather straps creaked loudly in the tight space. She set the heavy armor aside, revealing a worn, sweat-stained tunic. Finn knelt across from her, pulling a small roll of clean linen from his satchel. He hesitated, holding the cloth. "You are bleeding," he stated flatly. Tharja looked at his pale, trembling hands. In her exiled clan, showing a wound to a stranger was an invitation to a quick death. Here, the stranger held only a piece of cloth. She tilted her head back against the stone, offering her scarred cheek to the light. "Clean it, mapmaker." Finn moved closer. He dabbed the cut with a corner of the linen dampened by his canteen. The physical proximity was jarring. He could feel the dense, radiating heat of her large frame. He worked with the careful precision of an archivist handling brittle parchment. The gentle touch of his fingers contrasted sharply with the violent clash of metal and stone just moments prior. True trust is built when the person holding the blade lowers it, and the person expecting a blow receives a bandage instead. Finn cleaned the grit from her skin. The cut was shallow, but jagged. "The rust in this air will fester," he noted quietly. He retrieved a small, corked vial of herbal salve from his pocket. The sharp scent of crushed eucalyptus and beeswax filled the cramped alcove, masking the underlying odor of stale dust. He applied a thin layer to the wound. Tharja flinched slightly. Not from pain, but from the unfamiliar sensation of gentle care. "You carry remedies for wars you do not fight," she observed. Her yellow eyes studied his focused expression. "I carry them for the aftermath," he corrected. "The scholars in the upper academies study history from comfortable velvet chairs. My research required crawling through the forgotten collapsed tunnels below the merchant district. The feral dogs there do not negotiate." He tied a small knot in the linen bandage, securing it over the scrape. Tharja touched the bandage. The fabric felt absurdly soft against her calloused fingers. She thought of the usurper who had driven her from the high peaks. He had promised strength and iron to the clan, abandoning the old ways of mutual survival. She had fought her way out alone, bleeding and discarded. Now, an unremarkable human was freely spending his meager supplies to tend her minor scratches.
"The pack survives by protecting the weakest," she said softly. It was an old proverb of her people, spoken in the common tongue. Finn sat back, resting his hands on his knees. "I am undoubtedly the weakest in this room." "You have a different strength," she pointed a thick finger at his temple. "Your mind broke a stone giant. My axe only finished the chore." She reached into her belt pouch, pulling out another strip of the tough, salted ration. She offered him the larger half. Finn took the meat, his stomach rumbling loudly in the quiet space. The shared silence stretched between them, comfortable and solid. The oppressive weight of the mountain above them seemed to shrink, held back by the small circle of yellow lantern light. They ate slowly, listening to the distant, harmless settling of the deep earth. They still had a long, treacherous path ahead to reach the ancestral forge. The ruins were vast and undeniably lethal. But for tonight, the mapmaker and the chieftain had carved out a safe harbor in the dark. The heavy doors groaned open. A wave of intense, dry heat washed over them instantly, banishing the suffocating cellar chill of the deep ruins at the threshold. They stepped out of the silent darkness and into a vast, subterranean caldera. The ancestral forge bathed the immense cavern in a deep, pulsing amber glow. Sluggish rivers of molten rock cast long, dancing shadows against towering anvils carved directly into the mountain's foundation. It smelled heavily of burning sulfur and hot, oxidized brass. Finn felt the frozen, aching marrow in his fragile bones finally begin to thaw. He lowered his small brass lantern to the dusty floor. The ambient volcanic light rendered the meager yellow flame completely unnecessary. He pulled the heavy sacred wolf fur cloak tighter around his thin neck, savoring the radiant warmth seeping into his bruised muscles. The relentless, biting frost of the high passes felt like a distant nightmare in this glowing sanctuary. He fumbled with his battered leather satchel, his raw, bleeding fingertips protesting against the stiff brass buckles. He unrolled the stiff parchment map across a waist-high block of polished obsidian. The intricate ink lines mapping the lethal gauntlet behind them seemed incredibly fragile in the harsh light. He withdrew a short stick of soft charcoal from his inner coat pocket. He meticulously shaded the final chamber, his thin hand moving with practiced, obsessive precision. In his previous life, this completed draft would have earned a meager pile of copper coins from a greedy archivist. Today, it was the exact price of his continued breathing. Tharja did not look at the glowing rivers or the towering dwarven architecture. Her bright yellow eyes locked entirely onto a raised dais in the center of the vast room. Resting atop a solid basalt pedestal was a massive, jagged iron hammer. The heavy relic was forged from the dark heart of a fallen star, bound in thick, petrified leather. It was the undisputed symbol of her deposed family's right to rule the high peaks. The usurper had driven her clan out into the freezing steppes before she could claim it from the deep vault. She crossed the warm stone floor with long, deliberate strides. Her heavy, iron-toed boots echoed loudly against the ancient masonry. She stopped before the pedestal, the ambient amber light catching the faded white scars crisscrossing her grayish-green skin. For 10 grueling years, she had survived in the unforgiving lowlands, carrying nothing but a broken battle axe and a burning, silent shame. She reached out with her thick, calloused hands, her dense shoulder muscles bunching under her sweat-stained tunic. She gripped the thick handle, lifting the ancestral hammer with a slow, respectful exertion of raw power. The heavy iron head displaced the hot air with a low, resonant thrum. Finn paused his obsessive scratching, the soft sound of his charcoal stick ceasing entirely in the quiet cavern. He looked up, adjusting his crooked spectacles to observe the towering chieftain holding her birthright. She looked like a living extension of the brutal, imposing dwarven machinery surrounding them. Yet there was no triumphant roar, no violent swing of the weapon to test its balance. She simply held the massive hammer against her dented chest plate, her head bowed in silent reverence. "It is heavier than my father told me," she rumbled softly. Her deep voice lacked its usual abrasive edge, sounding almost fragile in the vast space. She turned slowly to face the frail cartographer across the room. Finn rolled up his finished parchment, sliding it safely back into the hardened leather tube. "Relics always grow heavier in exile," he replied quietly, his voice raspy from inhaling hours of granite dust. "The history adds weight to the iron." Tharja stepped down from the raised dais. She rested the heavy star iron hammer easily against her scarred shoulder. She walked back toward the human, her massive shadow engulfing his small, shivering form. The absolute physical contrast between them remained staggering, a towering mountain predator standing over a discarded, fragile scholar. But the rigid, bloody traditions of her past no longer dictated the space between them. She stopped a few feet away, looking down at the heavy wolf fur cloak still wrapped securely around his narrow shoulders. "My people believe that only the hardest stone breaks the wall," Tharja said quietly. She looked back at the dark, ruined archway they had barely survived. The shattered, pulverized remnants of the stone guardians still lay out there in the crushing dark. She looked back down at the frail human who had read the dead wall and found the hidden hinge. "Your fragile paper and ink proved the elders wrong." Finn offered a tired, genuine smile. He pulled her sacred pelt tighter against the lingering chill of the tunnel. The terrifying journey through the frost and the black rock had systematically stripped away their assigned roles of outcast and liability. "Brute strength can shatter the mountain," he agreed softly, the ancient fire reflecting perfectly in his scratched lenses. "But it takes a quiet mind to find the door."